Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us, those in person and online. My name is Michael Garrett. I'm the PI of the UCLA Canyon Health Research Study. And I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover today. Okay, I don't get much closer. That might require somebody with a smaller tummy. The remote is not working. Let's see. Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge a few people that have really been instrumental in organizing this meeting. Christina Battiati and Lisa Ballon, who are both in the room here to my right, have done a tremendous amount of work. It's a real privilege to organize these meetings, and we appreciate all their efforts. We have a lot of our study team joining us online, some of them unexpectedly so because of the weather conditions and their location in places like the Bank Canyon that are too dangerous to leave right now. Our agenda for tonight is to give you an overview of our health study, very short review. We presented this now at 3 other meetings, so we won't go into detail on that. And then we want to focus on our birth outcome analysis and preliminary results. So I'm going to give some context, and then Dr. Kimberly Paul, who's to my left over here, is going to present the methods, results, and talk about future directions. And then I'll talk about a few of the broader implications that arise from our findings. And we've left lots of time for questions and answers, so hopefully we'll get lots of interest from you in the audience. I want to turn over now to Lisa. She's going to walk us through the meeting logistics. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for making it out here or online. My name is Lisa Ballon. I am a facilitator. We lost the signal. Did I press the wrong button? Maybe our HDMI cord might be a little bit.
There we go.
Sensitive. Sorry about that. I am a facilitator with Sacramento State. We work as a neutral party to support stakeholder and collaborative engagement processes. We have a staff obviously in Sacramento, but we also have staff throughout the state, and I'm located down here, San Fernando Valley, and I've been here for a long time. I was here during the disaster and prior to that. I'm just going to review a few procedural items. If for those of you who, I'm sorry, just having a little volume problem. In the room. Is this better? Okay, thank you. And by the way, the speaker in the room is over here. So if for some reason you're having problems hearing, I'm not sure if it might be clear on the side of it. So Dr. Jarrett already went over the agenda. So briefly, just for anybody who's new to Zoom, just want to give a few instructions on how to access the Zoom features. If you'd like to leave a question or a comment, you can click on the Q&A box. Just ask if you see a question that's the same as yours, just to upvote it rather than repeat it, just to help us organize it a little bit. And if you'd like to give your comment verbally, we are going to see if we can accomplish that with the audio that we've got set up here today. You click on the reactions button and you raise your hand, and then we'll be calling on you. We do want to get through the entire presentation and then open up for questions and comments. So if you can hold your question or comment till then, we appreciate it. If you're in the room, we've got some paper if you want to take notes. Certainly you can do it online. You can enter your question at any time, but just know that we're waiting till we finish the presentation before we start answering them. We are recording the meeting tonight, so if anybody is asking a question orally online and you don't want your image recorded, we suggest that you leave your camera off. So we will be making the recording of the meeting available on our website, as well as the PowerPoint on the website. Next slide. Okay, just a few quick meeting guidelines, and then we'll get started. We just ask that everybody treat everybody here with respect, here and online. just recognize that all points of view have values. We welcome challenging some ideas, but not the person making the ideas. Request comment, conversational courtesy, and just to stay focused on the topic of today's agenda and honor the time we have. We have about, how many people are we up to online? It kept growing.
48.
We're up to 48 people online, and we have about 2, 4, 6, 7 people so far in the room. So we want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask their questions. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Jarrett to help study overview and to get us rolling into the main presentation for tonight.
Hold the mic in your hands.
Would you rather?
Kim, you can
Grab yours, you just have to press that. Press and hold it. Good one. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. So I just want to review the key questions that we're trying to address in this study at a very high level. The first is, did the exposure to the Aliso Canyon disaster adversely affect people's health in the past or currently? Do the ongoing emissions from the facility adversely affect people's health? And can we link the health outcomes to specific exposures that are from the Aliso Canyon facility? It's a big study. We have a lot of different components, and I just wanted to show you as an overview what we're doing with existing data and newly collected data. So what we're going to focus on tonight are the adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes, specifically the birth outcomes. The pregnancy outcomes like preeclampsia are going to be the focus of future research studies. We're also using neonatal blood spots. So every baby born in California gets a heel stick of blood, and we're able to request that heel stick blood spot for what's known as metabolomic analysis. So we can get literally thousands of different molecules and compare babies that were conceived and developed during the disaster to those that were outside of the impact zone to see if we find unusual markers of exposure or potential developmental problems. We're also using cancer registry data to look at whether or not there were unusual patterns of cancers in the area before, during, and after the event. And we're looking at healthcare utilization. So emergency room visits and hospitalizations for a wide array of health outcomes ranging from respiratory to cardiovascular to metabolic and also mental health. We also have access at UCLA to the California Health Interview Survey, which is an ongoing population representative survey that queries people on a wide array of health outcomes and their socioeconomic conditions. So we'll be looking at health outcomes via all of these existing data. And then we're also collecting new data on people, 400 in the infected area. And we went through at last meeting what the affected area is, and we'll review that again tonight briefly for the birth outcome analysis. And then 200 in control areas, particularly Simi Valley and Thousand Oaks, which we've shown in the past are relatively unaffected by the Aliso disaster, but they do have demographic and social characteristics and building stock that are fairly similar, as well as physical environmental conditions. And we're going to do the metabolomics that I mentioned. We're doing a wide swath of clinical exams and routine things like cholesterol and lipids panels that you might get taken at your regular annual meeting with your physician. And then we're doing a very comprehensive survey that Dr. Honghu Liu is leading. He's in the room here. He's the co-PI of the study with me, and he'll be designing that to assess people's mental, physical, and well-being, mental health, physical health, and their well-being. We also have additional ongoing focus group studies that Dr. David Eisenman is leading that are part of this attempt to understand the health of the residents now and compare that to the health of people in other areas. We're doing a lot so that we can try to link any health outcomes we find to environmental exposures. And here we're using remote sensing images, which have been very important for helping us to identify the impact zone. We've got atmospheric chemistry models, chemical transport models that Dr. Mike Kleeman at UC Davis, a world leader in this area, is developing so we can get predictions of air toxics and methane during the event and during a routine basis so that we can assign those to people living in the area and try to link that to the health effects that we observe. We're doing natural gas composition analyses, like unburned or raw natural gas in their stoves to get a better assessment of the composition of the natural gas so that we can better inform our modeling and also understand people's ongoing exposures to potentially small leaks in their homes. And we're just going into the field. We have people this week, for the first week, doing indoor-outdoor monitoring of air toxics and particulate matter. We'll also be speciating that for metals, which were found to be in abundance during the event and could still be emitted from the facility. And all of this is going to be brought together in a comprehensive environmental risk analysis that's being led by Dr. Tom McCone of Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I want to emphasize too that the risk analysis is not about replacing health studies. It's to try to get at rare outcomes which we couldn't study with epidemiology. So there are going to be some cancer outcomes, which even if we're very interested in them, we might not have enough of them in the affected area to be able to do a statistical analysis and differentiate them from other areas. But we can do an assessment of the likely exposures that people had during the event and on an ongoing basis to try to see whether we might expect to see elevated rates of cancer in the area. So that's what the risk assessment is meant to do. It's meant to fill in where we can't do the direct health studies. And I know there's been some concern in the past that this is a replacement for the health outcome analysis, but it really isn't. So we had hoped to have Dr. Beata Ritz here in person, but as I mentioned, she lives in Aliso Canyon, where there are unsafe conditions for driving right now. So I'm going to take over what she was going to present, but we're going to look at the rationale for looking at birth outcomes and present our first preliminary analyses. We're focusing on adverse birth outcomes that are known to be related to air pollution. And we know also that these can have lasting effects into childhood and even into adult disease formation, which I'll talk about more in a minute. We also look forward to hearing a lot, as I mentioned, from you in questions, and we'll do our best to answer those. So why would we look at birth outcomes? Well, these have been widely studied in relation to air pollution exposure, and developing humans are uniquely sensitive to environmental toxins. Their immune systems are not fully developed. When they're babies, their breathing rates are higher for body weight than adults. As they grow into children, their activity levels and outdoor activity levels are greater than adults. And as I mentioned, their immune systems are not developed. We also know that when babies are being formed in the womb, that those that are having placental malfunction will be less likely to get the nutrients they need to grow properly. And that results in low birth weight. So we've done several studies showing links to placental development and low birth weight and links to air pollution exposures at UCLA, which I won't cover, but we can discuss later if you like. Some of these exposures can have immediate effects in the post-neonate period, but also such as autism spectrum disorder, hyperactivity, other behavioral and developmental problems in early life. And then longer term, Dr. David Barker coined this fetal origins of adult disease. So many of our adult diseases have at least part of their origin in the exposures that we receive in the fetal state and into early childhood. So we want to make sure that we understand what kind of exposures could lead to adverse birth outcomes, because we know that these can have major implications as the children develop and even grow into adults. So we've been doing decades worth of epidemiological research addressing air pollution, adverse birth outcomes, and early childhood outcomes at UCLA. Dr. Ritz and I have worked together for nearly 20 years now on these studies. And she is, I think it's fair to say, the eminent or preeminent scholar in the world today who studies adverse birth outcomes and environmental exposures. We've had previous research that's shown that increases risk in adverse birth outcomes are associated with many of the contaminants that we know are present and emitted from the Aliso facility and were elevated during the event, like benzene, ethylbenzene, and toluene. You can see several of the papers that we published. There are more than 50 of them now that we've published, many of them together. And so we have a good, long understanding of these exposures and these health outcomes. I want to turn it over now to Dr. Kimberly Paul, who's in the urology department and the David Gevin School of Medicine at UCLA, and an expert in epidemiology, and she's going to share our preliminary findings. Paul.
Can you just lean in?
Yeah, let's test the sound.
Does it sound good to everybody on Zoom? Good here? Okay.
Encourage them to turn up their volume at home too.
Okay, yes, and we're being told to encourage you to turn up your volume if necessary, but I will really try to project into the mic here. Sorry if it's too loud for any of you. Okay, well, thanks, Mike. My name is Kimberly Paul, and I am an epidemiologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at UCLA, where for much of the past decade, I have been researching environmental exposures and how they influence disease. So today I am going to give an overview of our project investigating the influence of the disaster on adverse birth outcomes. First, we do want to start this off by noting that this is the first presentation of the results. So they have not been submitted for peer review yet, and the analysis and results are subject to change somewhat with this process. So for this project, our primary goal was to answer the question of whether pregnant women exposed to the disaster experienced adverse birth outcomes more than women who either lived in the community before the disaster or who were pregnant at the same time but unexposed. So we focused on low birth weight and preterm births, which I'll define shortly. In addition, we have other pregnancy and childhood outcomes we are investigating, which we'll go over at the end. So to answer this question of whether exposure to the disaster was linked to adverse birth outcomes, we obtained California's birth records from the state's Department of Public Health Vital Records. We examined all records of births that occurred between October 2010 to October 2019 for women living in the impacted zone and in unexposed comparison communities. So this allowed us to compare the frequency of the adverse birth outcomes within the community before, during, and after the disaster, as well as compare this to what was happening in communities unaffected by the disaster during the same time periods. We investigated 3 outcomes as part of this first project. First was the baby born with a low birth weight. And we used the World Health Organization's definition, which classifies low birth weight as less than 2,500 grams, or about 5.5 pounds. We also investigated term low birth weight, which are babies that are born low birth weight, but at term, meaning born at 37 weeks of pregnancy or more. So this excludes preterm births. Now, low birth weight is generally a result of either preterm birth, so a short gestation, or intrauterine growth restriction, which is when a baby in the womb doesn't grow at the expected rate during pregnancy, or a combination of both. So the first outcome, low birth weight, encompasses all causes, while the second outcome, term low birth weight, excludes low birth weight from preterm birth. And then finally, we looked at preterm birth itself, which are babies born before week 37 of pregnancy. Now, we selected these three outcomes because, as Mike covered, there is now a strong body of epidemiologic studies supporting links between air pollution exposure and both low birth weight and preterm birth. Now, the first thing we needed to do was determine if the mother was likely to have had exposure to the disaster while she was pregnant. So we wanted to know, was the mother living in the impact zone and whether her pregnancy overlapped with the disaster. So first, for all birth records, we geocoded the maternal residential address, which is provided on the birth record. This provides us with the latitude and longitude for each address. With this, we were then able to determine if the mother's residence was within the impact zone buffer. Now, this buffer has been discussed in previous community meetings, but briefly, we had 3 levels, which we considered as part of the impact zone. First was the mother's residence within 3 miles south of the disaster site. Then within 3 to 5 miles, and then out to 6.21 miles, which is 10 kilometers from the well. So with these expanding buffers, we'll be able to see if and where any effects drop off. So the map on the left demonstrates what we did with each point a maternal residential address. Though this one is showing for privacy, randomly perturbed latitudes and longitudes. So these are not the real addresses. But for each birth in the vicinity from 2010 to 2019. And then the 10-kilometer south buffer is shown in red. So the residences within the buffer are pink and considered to be part of the impact zone, while the gray are outside and not considered to be part of the impact zone. So we then needed to determine if the mother's pregnancy overlapped with the disaster. So if we know the mother was living in the impact zone, was she pregnant during the blowout? And if so, during which trimesters? So for each birth, we determined if the mother's pregnancy overlapped with the disaster, and if so, was that overlap later in pregnancy, during mid-pregnancy, or earlier in pregnancy? So our first direct exposure category would be women living in the impact zone whose 3rd trimester of pregnancy overlapped with the disaster. So this categorized all births which took place during the 118 days of the blowout until 2 months after the leak was plugged. Now we went to 2 months after because these women would have had 1 month of overlap with the disaster around the start of her 3rd trimester. So these women were most likely to have had late pregnancy exposure. Our second exposure category would be women living in the impact zone whose 2nd trimester overlapped with the blowout. So these women were most likely to have mid-pregnancy exposure. And then finally, the last exposure category, classified pregnancies with at least 1 month of overlap in the 1st trimester of pregnancy. So this classifies the early pregnancy exposures. We then classified the 3 years before and the 3 years after into 1 year periods and set the comparison category to a 2-year period from October 2010 to October 2012. So this way we can assess the prevalence of these adverse birth outcomes before the disaster, during, and after. So over this time range, from October 2010 through October 2019, there were about 14,000 births, which took place in the Aliso communities in that impact zone buffer, with just over 1,500 to mothers whose pregnancy overlapped with the disaster. Overall, about 6% of the births were low birth weight, 2.3% were term low birth weight, and 8.5% were preterm. So to answer the question of whether exposure to the disaster was related to adverse birth outcomes, we used what is known as the difference in difference model for analysis, where we compared the frequency of these adverse birth outcomes within the Aliso communities, again, before, during, and after the disaster, as well as compared this to what was happening in communities unaffected by the disaster during the same time. So this will allow us to assess whether the prevalence of these birth outcomes was any higher during the disaster than the community had been experiencing before, and whether this prevalence was higher in the impacted communities than other communities not impacted were experiencing. So we'll illustrate how over the next few slides with a hypothetical example. So there are several steps to this method. The first being to assess the outcome prevalence trends, both within the impacted community and in the unexposed comparison communities, but prior to the disaster. So you want to assess if the trends are similar before the disaster took place, and if there is a relatively constant difference between the outcome prevalence in the two groups. So if this is relatively constant, which it is in this example, it helps provide assurance that during the disaster, any difference in the outcome beyond what was seen before it had actually happened was related to the disaster. So this is called parallel trends. Now, the difference in the outcome prevalence observed between the Aliso communities and the comparison communities during the reference time period, which again, we set as a 2-year period from October 2010 through October 2012, will be one part of what's used to determine the expected difference during and after the disaster if it hadn't actually taken place. The other part used to determine this expected difference, again, had the disaster not actually taken place, is what happened in the unexposed communities during the same time periods. So if you were seeing relatively parallel trends between the two groups before the disaster took place, it's reasonable to assume that without the disaster, similar trends would be observed. So this is what this dashed line is now showing, the expected outcome prevalence in the time periods during and after the disaster, if it hadn't actually taken place. So there's a few things to note. This expected prevalence has the same difference between the two communities as was seen in the reference period prior to the disaster. And it follows the same trend as what's seen in the unexposed comparison community. As you can see now with the dashed line being parallel to the line from the unexposed group. Now, this dashed line is what we would expect if the disaster hadn't taken place. So it's what we refer to as the counterfactual, because in reality, of course, the blowout did occur. But this provides us with a best estimate of what could have taken place if the disaster hadn't occurred. The final step of this method is to compare what actually happened, the observed birth rate or adverse birth outcomes during and after the gas leak, to what was expected. So this difference in the estimated impact of the disaster is the estimated impact of the disaster on the birth outcomes. Now again, this is a hypothetical example to demonstrate this method and what we're assessing, but I will be showing you similar graphs based on the actual data. So this example also helps demonstrate why it's important to look at an unexposed reference community, as one could imagine a scenario where you only compared the birth outcome prevalence within the impacted community during the disaster to what was seen prior to the disaster. So in this scenario, there's clearly more adverse birth outcomes during the blowout than there was prior, but it is possible that similar trends were actually seen in unexposed communities as well. So this would help us in determining that the increase in the prevalence were actually unrelated to the disaster in this hypothetical scenario, as similar increases were seen in areas not exposed. And finally, it helps demonstrate the importance of the unexposed comparison communities in estimating what could have happened had the disaster not occurred. As again, this unexposed comparison group is used to help determine the expected trend in the impact zone during and after the disaster had it not occurred. So to ensure that we had the most robust results we could, and we're using appropriate comparison communities, we use several different comparison groups, including the rest of LA County outside of the impact zone, matched communities, which were communities with similar demographic and environmental factors, like traffic-related air pollution. And this matching has been discussed in previous community meetings. Then we also use the entire birth cohort across the state, excluding mothers who lived in rural communities, as well as neighboring communities. So those that lived within 10 miles of the well, but outside of that impact zone buffer. And finally, the rest of the San Fernando Valley. So based on the real data from the birth records and using the rest of LA County as a comparison community, what we found for low birth weight was that prior to the disaster, there was not much of a difference in the low birth weight prevalence observed in the Aliso communities relative to the rest of LA County. And this difference was reasonably constant over this period, as we did see relatively parallel trends. Now, during the disaster, for women living in the impact zone, whose pregnancy overlapped with the blowout during late pregnancy, so these women were most likely to have had late pregnancy exposure. The prevalence of low birth weight was approximately 50% higher than expected. So you can see the actual observed prevalence of babies born with a low birth weight to mothers living in the impact zone was about 9.5%, or 95 out of 1,000 births, versus the expected prevalence, which was around 6.5%, or 65 out of 1,000 births. We found this effect was incredibly robust using different unexposed comparison communities, with 3 shown here to demonstrate this. So first, using the entire state birth cohort, then the matched communities, and finally the neighboring communities. And while these graphs are small, the key takeaway is that when we use many different comparison groups, the observed effect remains. We saw similar results for term low birth weight, which was approximately 70% higher for women living in the impacted communities with late pregnancy exposure. And these results again were robust across the different unexposed comparison communities. Now, coming back to the buffer zone assessment, we looked at the odds of having a term low birth weight baby during the late pregnancy overlap period in the expanding buffers out from the well. So this will help us see where the effect discussed in the last few slides dropped off. And what we found was that there were elevated estimates out to about 6.21 miles, or that 10-kilometer buffer. So specifically, we compared births to mothers who lived in the different buffers to those who living in the rest of LA County during this late pregnancy exposure period. Now, we could not assess the estimated effect in the 3-mile buffer alone for term low birth weight, as the outcome sample size was too small for reliable statistics. But when we expanded out to 5 miles, what we found was that during this time period, the odds of having a term low birth weight baby were about 70% higher for women living in that 5-mile buffer than those in the rest of LA County. And about 80% higher for women living in that 5 to 6.21 mile buffer. Then the elevated odds drop off after 6.21 miles. So you can see this 6 to 9 mile buffer no longer has a statistically significant increase in the odds of having had a term low birth weight baby. So we do believe that 6.21 mile, or this 10-kilometer buffer, is capturing most of the effect. Now again, term low birth weight is a relatively rare outcome, which we expect to occur in between 2 to 3% of birth. During this late pregnancy overlap period with the disaster, it was still relatively rare, but did occur in just over 4% of the births in the impacted communities. Now, for preterm birth, there were periods of higher prevalence than expected before, during, and after the blowout. So during both the year prior to the disaster and the late pregnancy exposure period during the disaster, the prevalence of preterm births was about 30% higher than expected, although these were very borderline in terms of statistical significance. Now, during the year after the disaster direct exposure period, so these women would be conceiving as the well was being plugged through 2016. The prevalence of preterm births was about 50% higher than expected. So we do not actually have parallel trends here, as there was a period before the disaster where the community experienced more preterm births than expected. So this makes it difficult to determine that the differences during the disaster and in the year after were related to the blowout. It is certainly possible, but it can't be definitively concluded. So overall, this study provides evidence that there was a higher prevalence than expected of low birth weight and term low birth weight babies among women living in the impact zone, whose late pregnancy overlapped with the disaster. Now, we have additional research ongoing or planned with other adverse pregnancy and childhood outcomes. So we are assessing whether there was more preeclampsia in the impact zone during and after the disaster. Now, preeclampsia is persistent high blood pressure that develops during pregnancy. It typically resolves after the baby is delivered, and it's expected to occur in about 5% of pregnancies. Studies have suggested that maternal air pollution exposure may be related to preeclampsia. We will also be assessing whether there is any link between the disaster and autism spectrum disorder, linking the birth records to autism diagnoses identified through California's Department of Developmental Services. While few environmental risk factors for autism have been established, some studies have suggested prenatal and early life exposure to air pollution may be related. And then we will also, as Mike mentioned, be using neonatal blood samples to investigate whether the disaster was related to disruptions of any biologic pathways. So blood spots are taken from nearly all infants in California, and with parental permission, the leftover samples are stored and available for research. So these blood spots provide actual samples from babies drawn before, during, and after the disaster in the impacted communities. So this will allow us to compare biologic markers using what's known as high resolution metabolomics and potentially identify individual markers as well as networks that were perturbed in babies born to mothers living in the impact zone during the disaster versus those unexposed. Now I'll hand it back over to Mike here.
Mike, we had a little problem with your audio before, so just a reminder to yell and
Close,
straight and loud.
Okay, I can just vote from here, that's fine. Thanks very much, Dr. Paul. A lot of important and interesting results, and I think presented in a way that is very comprehensible. So I just wanted to remind people that we are going, our next big studies that we're doing are the ones that Dr. Paul talked about on neonatal blood spot analysis and the adverse pregnancy outcomes. We're gonna have time for questions and answers, but just drawing out some of the broader implications here, I think that when we look at the adverse birth outcomes, we know that many developmental problems, whether it's autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
I'm gonna give you this mic so you can hold it closer to you.
Thank you. These are related to adverse exposures in utero, and we want to make sure that the babies that were born during this disaster are not put at a disadvantage as a result of their exposures, or to at least understand who might be at that disadvantage. Secondly, the evidence base is, expansive, but mixed, I'd say, on, the fetal origins of adult disease. So for some diseases like respiratory and cardiovascular outcomes, we have a lot of evidence that these adverse birth outcomes can relate to the development of adult diseases. Other outcomes are more speculative: mental health, immunological dysregulation, and metabolic disorders. But all of them have been linked in one way or another. So it's important to understand what that means for the babies that were exposed during this period. I guess the third thing I'd mention is because we have a relatively constrained population that was affected, although the numbers look very daunting with 50, 70, 80% increases, those are relative risks. So if we look at the absolute numbers where we have, say, 64 people that are born low birth weight, out of that, or we might expect, if it's a 50% increase, you might expect that there's been about 22 or 24 of them that are a result of the exposures. And then if we look at something like autism spectrum disorder, which has a prevalence of about 4.6%, we might expect that about one of these babies might develop autism when they would not be expected to. So, and certainly that's a big concern, but the numbers are not huge because the population affected is not huge. And I think I'd like to conclude by, cautioning that although we've used the most advanced statistical methods possible, these are known as quality experimental design because we're trying to mimic something that is like a randomized trial where you get you get the drug, you get the treatment, or you don't. And in this case, the treatment, unfortunately, is the adverse exposures from the disaster, and those that live outside of it don't have it. But it's an observational study, so we're not controlling for all the other factors that can affect health. We do a lot with the statistical modeling to generate those counterfactuals, they're called, what would have happened if the disaster hadn't occurred, but we can't claim based on one study that we found a causal result. So there's still a possibility here that other variables could have intervened, or that our models are not fully specified, or that we didn't have a large enough sample to develop stable estimates. But we do see that they're very robust to any selection of controls. And honestly, we were surprised to see how robust they were. It didn't really seem to matter what group of controls we threw at the model, the results were virtually unchanged. So that gives us more confidence that what we are seeing is real. Before I go on to lead into the question and answer, I just want to highlight that Dr. Eisenman is running these focus groups, and we have some flyers on the table. We really appreciate your help in recruiting people. These are really meant to give us a qualitative understanding of what people experienced as a result of this disaster, because that's a big part of their well-being. Their emotional reaction to it is critical. So we're trying to understand that, and it's helping also to inform the types of questions that we're putting on to the survey. So if you know anyone that would be willing to participate in the focus groups, we do give incentives for your participation, small financial incentives to pay for your time. So if you could volunteer, we'd really appreciate that. And I want to remind everybody that we have evaluation forms for this meeting that we appreciate you filling out, because we want to keep improving in the way that we share information with you.
Ready to do it? Thank you.
Yes, I'm ready to shift over to question and answer. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Dr. Jarrett. So now we're going to get into the very important part of tonight's meeting, which is to hear your questions and comments. And we've got people in the room, we've got people remotely, and I'm going to alternate between the two. So if you're in the room and you'd like to make a question, if you could ask a question or make a comment, if you raise your hand, and I'm going to keep a few. Is Serena, is that your name? Okay. Anybody else in the room? Matt? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to take and right. Okay. I'm gonna take a question in the room first, and then we're gonna go to online. So Serena, I'm gonna hand you the mic, and just so people online can hear you, you have to kind of angle it this way.
How can everyone hear me? Okay, I just had some clarifying questions about the study, which, were, what was the total sample size? When you talk about the absolute numbers, what does that mean? And then, Dr. Paul, I believe you mentioned, you said when you were talking about preterm birth, that it was borderline in terms of statistical significance. I think that goes back to the absolute numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, during the actual disaster, so in that first late pregnancy exposure period, which was the day the disaster was reported, October 23rd, 2015 to 2 months after. So that period, had 719 births. Now, during all the combined exposure periods, so that includes also women who had the mid-pregnancy as well as late pregnancy, so that's actually about a full year. That was closer to 1,500 births. Now, this is with that 10-kilometer buffer. So if we go down to the 3, it's actually significantly less. No, there's, more dense population, a little lower in the North area. Our control communities were, of course, much larger, right? LA County had hundreds of thousands of million, I think we had 3 million births. So to work with. The matched communities, we also made sure that we had a robust sample size to include for that comparison group. So we really were just limited by the impact zone in that number.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but don't you have a slide of the sample sizes?
Yeah, we did. Yeah,
Can we go back to that? That would really
You
help.
want to go back to slide 21?
Thank you.
Doesn't seem to be going back, but I can.
You can use the
Sorry to
arrow.
interrupt.
No.
But I would love to get by, to amplify her question, would like to get by the radius. the
Yeah.
sample Size for each.
I did not put that on the slide. I can share that information
That would
with
be
you.
great.
If we are planning to submit this, of course, to peer review, and there will be all the details, methods and information in there. So this is just the full 10-kilometer buffer. So you can see the 3 in red were those direct exposure periods. That's that 1 year from October 2015 to October 2016. So you can see during the full time period in the Aliso impact zone buffer, the prevalence of low birth weight, internal birth weight, that's what those 6.2%. That gets it closer to what we expected, right? The other slide will tell you what we actually observed, which was closer to 9.5% low birth weight, and over 4% low birth weight. Yeah, and the overall sample is that top number. So you see the Aliso community 10K south buffer and that 14,000 number, that's the overall sample size. That's all births.
Thank you. We're gonna take a question online. We have a question from Sandy. I'm gonna ask you to unmute. Sandy, if you're able to unmute. Maybe I'm gonna come back to you if I'm gonna try that one more time. I don't know if on this computer it's not. Are you able to ask Sandy to unmute Tina?
She could be saying no.
Okay, so I am going to take a question online that's in the Q&A box. Is it possible that exposure to the chemicals emitted prior to the blowout has affected children who grew up in the North Valley, especially when it concerns autoimmunity disorders? The question is it possible that exposure to the chemicals emitted prior to the blowout has affected children who grew up in the North Valley, especially when it concerns autoimmunity disorders? a little bit, a little different topic than,
So that's, I guess, chemicals emitted from the Aliso facility.
I believe that.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's definitely possible. Unfortunately, we don't have very good estimates of what was emitted from the facility before the blowout. There's, you know, much more concentrated monitoring during the blowout and probably up to 11 months thereafter. Now we have ongoing data that we're getting from the Argo Scientific Group. Okay, yeah, so, we don't have very good, estimates of the exposures. We're developing the chemical transport models, which will give us some estimates of exposures based on emissions inventories. So it is possible that there are autoimmune impacts from air pollution. And it's possible that the facility did cause some of that, but we are somewhat hindered in our ability to assess exposures before the blowout. So it's going to be a challenge to identify those.
Thank you. Our next question in the room is from Matt.
Hey, Matt DeCugo here. This is gonna be all available online, right? All this information. Okay, so there was one spike pre-blowout in one of those measurements on that kind of skew thing, I think you said. That kind of threw it off. Are you trying to correlate anything like that with what may have been going on at that facility at the time? Because there's a lot of stuff that's public information about activities up there, emissions up there, from like AQMD, CalGEM, which used to be Dogger, CPUC, even NASA.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe you'd be a little bit better able to speak to just the ongoing exposures that were happening before. It's certainly possible.
No, I'm saying, are you trying to correlate anything with like that? Specifically, I'm asking about that one previous to the blowout, because we know that people have been having these issues long before the blowout.
Yeah, it's actually something we can probably try to dig into a little better. Mike, maybe you can comment on. So this is just based on that buffer zone, was the mother living there? But the exposure core is also estimating exposures, all sorts of different pollutants before, during, and after, you know, based on some measurements and other modeling. So once we have those, we can see, because you do start to see it, you know, kind of going up there in maybe 2013 and then 2014, right? And then of course 2015. So, you know, I'm not totally familiar enough with the facility. Is that did something change? Did
Well,
you
yeah.
expect to see more?
Prior to the blowout, public record, they were looking for money to do maintenance on that facility because they admitted it was leaking over some long period of time, and they needed to do maintenance, and they didn't.
Yeah,
That could be that curve right there.
you know, we will go back and dig for these records and, you know, when they reported anything, because if that happened when it's spiking there, I mean, you know, it's something we can throw in our models and kind of
Starting in 2009.
2009, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so we've been developing I think the most comprehensive database of all of possible exposures. And definitely, we just got a big bolus of information that we've been working on for probably 9 months to get from LA County. So we did get that last week. We're digging into it. It includes things like the mesh sampling that was taken right over the blowout, other sampling that's taken very close to the site. So we don't have a good assessment of all those data yet, but we are also using all of the self-reported data that we can find. We're in contact with the Public Utilities Commission to get all of their data. I think that probably our best shot at this is with the chemical transport models, which are giving us sort of 1 kilometer grids, which we hope to get down to 250 meters in the future. which have a very comprehensive suite of pollutants. So that we can start assigning those and directly assessing the exposures, not just based on our buffer area, but based on the actual estimates of the exposure. So it's possible that that could be part of what's going on here. But we don't know yet.
And I will say too, where you see it high in 2010 and coming down, there have been some very well reported effects of the recession on birth outcomes. So you see that it's higher and going down in both the Aliso communities and in these kind of unexposed match reference communities. So that's what really probably is happening with it's going down. Now, why is it going back up?
Thank you. You have anything you want to do? Okay, thank you. We had a question online in the Q&A box, and the question is, for term low birth weight, does the 6.21 mile buffer zone result in a higher risk compared to the 3 to 5 mile buffer zone? How do you interpret this result? And Dr. Ritz put a response that I'll read it and see if we have anything to add here. She's saying it is probably a chance finding. In other words, some wiggle room due to small number, but basically the increases are the same.
Yeah, so that's again, if we put it back on that sample size, during that late pregnancy exposure in the full 10-kilometer buffer, we had 27 babies that were born terminal birth weight. Now, when you split that into 3 different buffers, you're getting into very small numbers. And like, you imagine flipping a coin 10 times, you think it's going to be 5, right? But it wouldn't be weird to get 7 heads and 3 tails. So this is just I agree. I think it's just variation with the smaller numbers for terminal birth.
Thank you. Our next question in the room is Craig.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for being here and for the weather and the traffic. So really interesting stuff. And, to compliment Matt's points about the pre, and then you had a concern about the post blowout, right? And you're like, well, we don't know. So by living here, what we do know, and what's the new name for doctor? Cal Gem advised us that, all the exposures went into the soil. And the entire hill is off gassing for a very long time, and it's probably still off gassing today. So I think there is a post sealing of the well exposure that needs to be considered and would explain exactly what I saw. And Dr. Jared, I apologize, I'm gonna make a couple statements and I do have some questions. I do understand, percentage versus actual number, but those percentages are very alarming, and this could be just scratching the tip of the iceberg. This is the first time you guys have exposed any of your analysis to what we're needing to see the cancer, we're needing to see the biomarkers, we're needing to see all that. This is very concerning to the community. I know from talking to folks. Curious about, here's a couple questions. I've looked at some other studies around birth weight and air pollution, et cetera. And not only did they look at the occurrence, but also they looked at the birth weights within percentiles. So they could, and I'm wondering if that would also be of value because maybe we had less higher birth weights, which, like to know if that's an indication of a health risk. And then also my question is, will you look at that? Will you look at miscarriages? Any birth defects or anomalies? And lastly, a broader question for you as a science person with this study, what would you say is the call to action?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to take them as I remember them. First of all, the Cal Gem and the long-term exposures, yes, especially because we know signatures of heavy metals were detected in people's homes, and those don't necessarily go away. So for that preterm, the elevated preterm births in that 2016, that year after period, there are a number of kind of these indirect real exposures from the disaster. And then there is, of course, the stress and anxiety and mental health effect of women who were living in this community and exposed, knowing what's happening and conceiving. That of course likely had a very real as well. So yes, this 3-term period after, I agree, I think it very much could be related. We can't conclusively say anything like we did with the low birth weight, because we had that period before. But again, it's something we'll explore more based on what we've heard today. So then, remind me of the second question.
Miscarriages
Oh,
and birth defects and quartiles or deciles birth weight.
Yeah, I
So
think
you want me to answer that?
Dr. Dixon online, she can answer this, I think.
Yeah, so birth defects are very rare. If we have trouble with terminal birth weight, which is 2.3%, birth defects are around 1%. So we have even less to work with during this time period. And also this data is very hard to come by. Miscarriage data does not exist, at least not systematically anywhere. And for the percentiles, small for gestational age is basically similar to what you see for low birth weight. But yes, we can look at large for gestational age, and that would be easy to do.
yeah, and I must say, we did do some supplementary analysis looking at birth weight itself instead of categorizing it. And what we saw was that for babies that were born, on the lower end, maybe 3,000 grams or less, to women living in the impacted communities during this late pregnancy exposure period, they on average have babies about 100 grams less than women who had also lower birth weight babies in the rest of LA during this period. So not only were they lower birth weight, but they were lower than expected. So that was a number on 100 grams.
Yeah, regarding the miscarriage, we may worry for. Yeah, we will try to incorporate the miscarriage information into our survey. We have a total 2,000 and 1,400 in the affected area, 600 in the comparison community.
Of miscarriages.
We are going to incorporate that, try to incorporate that.
So you have data.
We plan.
No,
We have
no,
not started.
this is
We're
for
going
our-
to collect the data. The survey, yeah.
Oh, by survey, via survey, thank
Yeah.
you. Call to action, last, it's a.
Yeah, okay, let me say one more thing about the miscarriages while we're on that topic is, it's actually something I've been thinking about too, and as Beata mentioned, the data isn't really there, it's very hard to come by. But what we do have is the number of births that were happening in the community. So I've been trying to think of ways that we can say, what's the birth rate any different during these times? Which might give us some kind of indirect answer to that question, what you're expecting X% and that, so it's something on our minds that we'll hopefully be able to get an answer for. Call to action.
Yeah, the other thing that we discussed is to look at sex ratio. So there's a larger literature on sex ratios changing during times of distress. Because we want to be able to better understand whether it was the stress of the disaster, the exposures of both. So for example, during times of extreme economic downturn, extreme heat, you see the male-female sex ratio, which is normally about 1-to-1. It goes up, so you have more females than males. And that's something that we can look at to try to parse out whether this effect was due to the stress that women were experiencing. So, I mean, call to action, I think, number one, we never want to have this happen again, right? So, that behooves the regulators and the gas company to do everything they can to avoid it and to better manage that facility, or potentially to consider closing it. And, that's something that it's beyond our control. All we can do is supply the best scientific evidence. But I think, looking forward, heaven forbid, if anything like this ever happened again, it seems to me like the most effective route of action would be to evacuate all of the pregnant women immediately. Even before you know what's going on and how big it is, they should not be there. Because we, especially we're going to go in to look at their health as well. And next. And then we started looking at preeclampsia, a very serious condition, or complication of pregnancy. So that's something that, you know, if they should probably be evacuated immediately. If, you know, this is something I advise everybody in the San Fernando Valley, whether you're living close to Aliso or not, you should be using HEPA filters in your home if you can. So those could be put on your central air conditioning system. You get standalone HEPA filters, but those will help to deal with at least some of the particulate matter that could be as for the, you know, the routine emissions that are ongoing, we are all over the satellite and aircraft retrieval data that monitors methane. We have Dan Cosworth and Marion Marley are two of the best people in the world. We're doing satellite retrievals, working on it. And you know what we are seeing is that we can detect other leaks that are coming from the facility, but they're nothing compared to what happened during the event. So what we're trying to do now is to quantify whether or not there's enough ongoing exposure to be a concern from that leakage that happens through the geological formation, where the gas is stored and where it seeps into the hill. So that's something that I think we're going to have a very good handle on. Unfortunately, as I said before this, there was really not any major monitoring going on. So we have a bit of a blind spot there. This event actually spurred a whole new field of inquiry about monitoring methane from space and from aircrafts. So there's been a huge amount of activity that's happened since. And we're assembling every possible scene that we can to understand where those leaks might be coming from and who they might affect.
Thank you. We have Dr. Ritz. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I would like to add one more thing. We talked about the biomarkers from the blood spot. And if we are able to find that the babies who were in the womb during the time of the blowout actually show different biologic markers for something going wrong in their growth, in their development, then we can actually also look whether that is similar for the time period right before or after, because that would also indicate that, you know, something has either started early or hasn't really completed its effect yet. And how do we do this? By comparing these markers with babies born in other communities that did not have the same exposures. So that would also be one way to kind of expand beyond what, you know, these time periods of the direct disaster were, in case there were exposures before and or after.
Thank you, Dr. Ritz. We have a question online. I'm going to ask Julie to unmute.
Did you call on me? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you great.
Oh, okay. Okay, and the woman that just spoke maybe answered some of this. I guess my question is, I know the information that you have been retrieving has to do just before, during, and after the blowout. Do we know anything about several years before, what the birth rate and premature births would be? And certainly currently, I don't know if the continued chemical exposure and leaking from the oil wells continued to be an issue, and it not just the time of the blowout. It looks like it continued, and even looks like a year later, it was a higher percentage.
Yeah, do you maybe want to show the preterm slide?
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, I think the idea is that can we start doing things, and we do have options about
before we go to the preterm slide, I just want to emphasize that what we see in what I consider to be the key study findings is that we are seeing those levels showing the blue line drop back down, so they're very similar to the control communities. And these are statistical markers of how confident we are about the result. And you can see that they're not as small as they are in the control communities, but that they are overlapping. So what we've got is evidence that for the preterm birth, or sorry, for the low birth weight and term low birth weight, we are seeing levels return to what we would expect based on a variety of control communities. And that's, LA County, statewide, all urban areas, match controls. So we don't see any evidence of that. And Kim, I don't know if you can remind us for the preterm birth, what's the sample size there?
Yeah, preterm, we expect about 8.5%. So during that late pregnancy exposure period, we had about 60, during all the exposure period, it was just over 100.
Yeah, so there's a lot of noise in these data. But we can go back farther to look to see. We have data that's geocoded that Dr. Ritz has put together in her lab that goes back to 2002. And we have data that goes out to 2022. There's about a 2-year lag in the data that we can get from the state. So we can look at other periods too. And this is perhaps one of those outcomes where we want to look at the continuous exposures when we have those ready for our models, so that we can look at how they relate and whether or not the levels of certain contaminants at Aliso are linked to these elevated levels at periods outside the disaster. But what,
it would be very helpful if we could see that many years before and then certainly currently, because what I hear you, I think what you were saying is that at the time of the methane explosion, that's the period of time when the low birth rate and early births, etc., happened, but not currently or before. I guess that's what I'm really trying to figure out, because there has been other times when chemicals are released in the, at the site at Aliso Canyon. So I'm trying to figure out if it was just during that time period or it has continued but less, or even if you go back, I think you said, did you say 2004? I'm not sure what year you said, which would predate it a lot, so we could see what was going on then.
yeah,
We
we can
have
look
data
at that.
going back, sorry. We have data going back to the 1990s if you want to. So that's not a problem. The problem is going forward because you have COVID. And COVID did a lot of things to birth weight as well and birth. But yes, of course, we can compare it to other communities because COVID might have had the same impact.
I just want to point something else out though, that when you look at these blue bars compared to the red bars, the blue bars are very big because we have smaller sample sizes, and that makes our estimates less certain. So it takes a rather big effect to detect something that's statistically different, as we have here, where you can see the blue bar exceeds the top end of the red bar. So we can say that this is more than would have occurred by chance. And otherwise, for these areas where we might have elevated exposures, we're going to have a huge effect for it to show up with the relatively small number of birds that are affected. So we can go back, but we have to probably focus in on those outcomes which you think are going to be most productive. But we'll go back and look at this if that's something that would be helpful from a community perspective. I think that scientifically it's going to be hard to detect. And you can see here where we've got some areas coming out of the recession where it's virtually identical to the control communities. but we're not sure what's happened in here, so. It's worth interrogating this outcome a little bit more so we can better understand that.
Thank you. We've got a comment in the room.
I want to say Brian and then Matt, since he didn't have a chance to.
I'm a little concerned about the other aspects of this, which is Aliso, which is Sunshine Canyon and the locations more defined of those that are suspected. And whether there is a accumulation effect here. If this, we know that any gas facility leaks. And if it leaks for a long period of time, is there an impact on society from that? Does that accumulate in the people? But the one anomaly that you have, which is just prior to, I really would like to see that you do a solid evaluation of Sunshine Canyon and the effect of the airplanes. Because there is a vast increase in size of aircraft that fly over there. They are no longer little two passenger jets. They are corporate jets and they are constant. So there has been a lot of concern lately for that. So I hope that we take a more in-depth look at Sunshine and the jets, as well as the impact of accumulation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know we have modeled, basically jet and aircraft pollution before. I think it's something we can.
Yeah, we've done a study of ultrafine particles around LAX, but not any other airports.
So are you talking about Van Nuys Airport? Is
The
one
main flyover is over this area.
for Van Nuys or for
Everybody-
LAX?
Everybody coming into Van Nuys is
Okay.
flying over this area. The majority of flights come over this area. They fly over my house every 10 to 15 minutes. Right, it's a constant thing, especially on the weekends. So I know that a lot of people are upset with the soot that is falling on their houses. And it's a constant thing. I mean, it really is something that we should know the impact of. I'm not suggesting that it is causing a problem, but I am suggesting that it is serious enough of exposure that we need to know what is happening there and if that's an impact. With regard to Sunshine puts out chemicals on a constant basis, but there are peaks and valleys. It's very possible that Sunshine helps to increase that pre-event, pre-Aliso event as well. So there are areas that I think are very serious to look at. I don't know if there's a major impact, but I think it certainly should be put to rest that we have done everything possible to evaluate.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely look into that, and, we're just starting another study that was funded by the Health Institute. It's led by Dr. Suzanne Paulson, but Dr. Switz and Zhu, who's part of the study as well, and I are key collaborators. And part of that is to look at new sources of transportation emissions, including jets. So we're doing monitoring all over LA that's specifically designed to try and detect signals from flyovers, because we know they do emit ultrafine particles. And as part of our field study here, we're going to have a large comparable amount of data that's taken in the affected community that we can compare to those other sites we're looking at work on. So we'll definitely fold that into our analysis.
Thank you. We have one question in the Q&A box. Will there be a follow-up study for those exposed after the period of 2019?
Yes, like Beata had mentioned, this is absolutely something we can do. We can get the birth records, and it's something we can pursue. We cut it on purpose in October 2019 because of COVID. We just know what was gonna happen, but there's a lot of research out there now that we can kind of glean from, and yeah, we can look before and after.
Thank you. We have another comment in the room.
So are you taking into account women that were pregnant? And exposed during some period of the blowout, but left, moved away and had their baby somewhere else?
Yeah, this is a really, really great comment, and not right now, and that could actually underestimate what we're seeing, because the maternal residence is based on the birth record, which is based on where the mother was living at birth. So if a mother was pregnant and she moved and was living wherever else and gave birth there, she would likely say her residential address was where. So she would not be included as part of this, in this impact zone. So if we actually had less, exposure and outcomes that were happening in these kind of unexposed groups, yeah, it's something that could underestimate effects. Do you want to comment on that? Because I know that, you guys had a plan for how we were gonna.
So
Speak
that,
right.
that's related with the mobility data. We are collecting mobility data. We will actually, is going to get everybody who moved out since the 2015, the blowout until actually basically now. And we are going to identify all those who moved out and back and where they are. But that will just will provide us background information. And down the road, if we do need to survey or collect data from those cohorts, that will be available. We work with SPS, which is the survey firm in the area, and we actually finalize pretty much the agreement of those between.
And one more comment on that, so if we have estimates of that background information, say that 10% of the women who would have had exposure over pregnancy, we can do simulations to see how the analysis we just did would have changed. So if, for instance, we assume 10% move, we assume they had a similar rate of observed birth outcome, what would it have been in this scenario or that scenario? So this is called a bias analysis, and we can do it to assess if we're estimating and pretty reasonable or it's underestimated or.
Thank you. We have some more questions in the room. We're at 7:25, so I just want to note for anybody who has to leave early, thanks again for coming. If you are able to fill out our evaluation, it really helps us improve these meetings. And also, just a reminder, if you haven't already signed up for our email list, you can go to our website. We'll put the chat in the, we'll put the link in the chat as well. That will just help to keep you informed, and also a reminder about the upcoming focus groups if you're interested. We'll put links in the chat and it's all online. So we've got two more, I don't see any online questions or raised hands. We've got two more people would like to make a question or comment in the room. So to answer that same questions that people moved out, actually if people moved out, they moved out right away because they have a really severe situation that have to really get out. So I think it's really important to look at those people. So as that cancer study, because I already know that people moved out have a cancer outside of the state. And so I think it's really important. Those are
The most affected.
yeah, one of the most affected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very reasonable to assume that women who were pregnant would have been very concerned and perhaps would stay with family. We'll try to do whatever we can to get estimates and to try to include this in our models and see how that would have affected.
Yeah, we track every single. Yeah, we going to track every single cohort, every single person. And actually we will find out until they never moved like several times since 2015, and we'll track all those intermediate movement and up to now. that database will be available. We actually also have another database is, remember, we're going to have 2,000 surveys. Those are the address-based selecting household. We're going to find out for those 2,000 household, what the history, when actually the people moved in, moved out for that 2,000 house. So we will have two separate mobility databases.
Thank you. We have another question in the room.
Thank you. So this is gonna get challenged undoubtedly. So two thoughts that parallels what Matt and Kyoko were saying. There's a dampening factor here that I think should weigh into the way you present this information. Not only did people leave the community, maybe had birth elsewhere, but a lot of the people left, right? They were relocated. So I think, so it's quite possible, maybe you'll find this out through your cohorts, that they were only here for the very beginning. The pregnant women were only here for the very beginning of the blowout and weren't here for the entire duration. So I think that's holding your numbers down, right? Your unfavorable outcomes down. And then the other one that's going to be on the pushback is going to be the stress, which you mentioned, which certainly would contribute. But the fact that it's pre the blowout, when everyone's minding their own business, had no idea even was up in the hill behind us, there was no flow. Yet the occurrences of unfavorable outcomes is there. So I think it all points back to it's the hill, it's the hill. So this is going to be challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's been brought up in the scientific oversight committee as well. And by many collaborators who, share their opinions is this the chemicals or is this the stress? I mean, I imagine modeling this, I imagine the start is the blowout. And then you have your outcomes at the end. Now, both that total effect is what we're showing you right now. It could be delineated into a chemical effect and it could be delineated into a stress effect. But the effect still starts with the blowout, right? With the disaster. Yeah.
Not the facility.
Right. Now for these preterm effects that we're seeing prior to the blowout, yes, it's definitely something we really we need to dig into a bit more. Again, we have models on actual pollutant levels, so we can assess whether there's variability even within that impact buffer, of course, on how much exposure people had. So these estimates will give us that sort of information. So we'll be able to model the amount of exposure relate to the outcomes within the community itself as well. So that's something that may shed light because those exposure estimates, of course, should show higher levels when the blowout was happening, but we'll have estimates in 2015, 2014 as well, too.
Yeah, we already have all the estimates for during the event, and we're going back another 18 months before, 18 months after. They're very computationally intensive models. We've been running, Dr. Kling's done this dozens of times, and we will get the estimates, and we'll downscale them to 250 meters. And I know Matt's been concerned about the canyons. Our latest remote sensing retrievals are not showing any sort of snaking along canyons for methane at least. So it's still possible we'll see it when we downscale even more. But once we have those estimates, we can start looking at the direct pollutant effects versus the stress. What we have here is we're unable to determine whether it's psychosocial stress, air pollution, or both. I think what we can say though is that the patterns here, at least for the low birth weight and term low birth weight, are really unequivocal. They're very strong. They're significantly different than what we see in virtually every other control community. And I think, the secondary question would be, was it the stress or was it the air pollution? If we want to say it was likely the event, it certainly points in that direction. And then we can parse out which part of that equation is most important.
We have another question in the room.
On the question of tracking folks who moved, Could you clarify for me what radius you're gonna use to do that? I don't know, yeah, I mean, to me, it's helpful to have where it fits into your other radius, I've seen that on the map. Because I don't understand how many, and how far away. Yes.
Yeah, so for the mobility data, the radius right now, we have been discussing that for quite a long time. Right now, we're doing it at 5 miles radius, up to 5 miles, which is cover majority of the radius, up to the south, the person that is used.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions online. Does anybody in the room want to make a final question or comment? We've got one more.
I can share my screen.
Just a quick comment. I was not sure what I was gonna hear today. And I was concerned because of our first meeting when we had it, and I have to tell you that I am pleasantly surprised that the information is being presented the way it is, and the impact is being presented what I think is fairly. So I hope that you keep up the good work, and I'm sorry that DHP took 9 months to get you information. I think we all know that that is a real problem.
Yeah, thank you, those salutary comments. Certainly, we're gonna try to keep supplying the most complete and honest science that we can. And that's what we're doing now. We're getting this to you first before we publish it. It's something we should talk about in the future though, because, our ability now to publish in the very top journals is diminished because they won't allow us to present anything publicly before it appears in the journal. So if you want to go to the New England Journal or the Lancet or Nature, I publish in all those journals, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. If you do a presentation like this, you disqualify yourself. So we are going to publish in high quality journals, but they won't be the very top. So that's something that maybe we can talk about at a future meeting because there's a tension there. I think that the best science reported in the very best journals is always the most credible. But we're still going to be presenting very rigorous journals that will accept the presentation elsewhere, like Environment International or Science Advances. But we won't necessarily be able to publish in those top journals. So if you want to keep proceeding it like this, it might mean the journals we publish in are not as high.
To what level can we publish any of this information?
I'm gonna ask you
To what level could we publish any of this information? Are we allowed to take it off your website and publish it in another website for our community? Just need to know, that's all.
Well, it is going to be available on our website. Do you need republish it or put a link?
Well, yeah, we, the community, will undoubtedly continue to have meetings. And we have websites, and we would like to know if we can put this information or just a link on our websites.
Yeah, maybe, can I take that one back to the team and people like that, so that, I mean, ultimately, when it's on the website, if you want to capture it in some way and take the data, you can, but I wouldn't encourage that.
As long as you're supporting us, we want us for you.
Okay.
We have our public information officer here in there a little more.
Yeah, I think a good thing is, like you said, Mike, warrants further discussion, but I don't see any problem whatsoever with sharing links to this information, because that's where it's presented by us, and I say by us just in the sense of the context of how information is shared is also there. And I think one of the things that, and I was a reporter years ago, but just always the fear that sometimes I would have expressed to me was, you grab one slide out of the deck and without the slide before or the slides after, it can seem scary or it can seem like, oh, there's no problem. When I think, and I appreciate the comments, I know how important it is to everybody here to be there for you guys to have a meeting like this. So I think sharing a link is great, because I think it helps people maybe who couldn't attend online tonight, or people who couldn't show up here, they can get, oh, this is where it is. My friends who I've been talking to for years about this said, hey, check this out. So I love the idea of sharing.
Maybe I'll make one other comment too, just ensure that when we do publish this in peer review, we will be publishing open access. So that means anybody can get to it, you don't need pay for the journal or an article or whatnot, it'll be open access.
Thank you. I think Dr. Jared has some additional information that he wants to share with everybody here.
Yeah, it seems like this has come up a few times and we have new information from the last time we presented this, so I just wanted to quickly talk about the impact zone and some of the work we've been doing. So these are new retrievals from the adverse aircraft flyovers. And you can see here's the Aliso Canyon leak site. These bright concentrated areas are part of the methane plume. There are these smaller pockets which we think are likely noise because they're not formed in any coherent patterns. But this is sort of the distance that we're seeing in the remote sensing now. So it's going out to about that 5 mile radius. We do see some days where the wind direction changed and went the other way. Also, there's another day, another retrieval. The limitation here is that we usually just have one flyover per day. So, but you can see that we are getting we're down into this area of Chatsworth where we are now. And then we're using these chemical transport models, which have a lot of atmospheric chemistry built into them, physics, as well as emissions inventories for all possible sources, including Aliso Canyon. So these are the methane concentrations that we're estimating, the benzene concentrations, and that outline is just Porter Ranch area. So you can see that there were some elevations above background going well past the end of Porter Ranch. But this starts to show some of the challenges, where we are now in Chatsworth has a lot of light industry. So the toluene concentrations are actually higher as we go away from the site. So this is just some of the work we're doing to affirm what we're looking at as the impact zone, but then also we're going to be taking these estimates and putting them directly onto the health outcomes. Matt?
Yeah, so
1 second.
that's exactly what I was talking about at the last meeting. You take a big radius of samples, but the affected people are the ones down the middle. That, to me, that just skews this thing to all hell. And that's what our own on the ground surveys door to door and living next door to neighbors and down the street to neighbors that weren't affected tells us that it's not the whole neighborhood. I mean, the whole radius, it's like right there. That's the people affected.
Yeah, so I mean, once we have the actual exposures estimated for the chemical transport model at 250 meter resolution, we'll be able to account for those differences, and they'll be in the model.
Yeah, we'll do a new updated analysis. So right now we're using an impact zone buffer and just comparing the prevalence, with unexposed communities, and we're seeing that 70 or 80% increase. Once we have these estimates from the exposure core, we'll actually plug them in as a continuous variable and say, okay, within the buffer in this area, was living right under this plume associated with the higher risk, and we'll have those numbers in that assessment to get at that.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
That's
I just wanted
methane
to share that with you.
That's methane only?
That's just methane.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions online. Last call for questions or comments in the room before we. Thank you again so
I
much.
just wanted to,
I'm gonna let, my close this out. I'll just say thanks to everybody for coming and hope everybody drives home safely.
yeah, on the methane, definitely, we know there's very strong correlation between methane and a lot of the air toxics. So that it's one of our sentinel markers for what's coming off the facility that we can measure from the infancy, but we can't necessarily measure. So I think, it's giving us a good approximation of where.
We also saw data that there wasn't a correlation with benzene and methane that was provided by AQMD.
Let's give Craig a mic so people online can hear. So yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen those data and it certainly doesn't agree with any of the data. we've analyzed from many different studies around fracking sites and other places where there's methane present.
Okay, so great, terrific. Maybe we should take a look at that data. I can share it with you. And you can see that there is not a correlation. And so just where the methane is, that's why we wanted much more than methane monitors in what Argus did. We want to know the full gamut. So if you can demonstrate historically that they are highly, highly correlated with the data we saw from AQMD, and who knows, it may have been faulty data or inaccurate.
Yeah, definitely, we'd like to see
The
those
AQMD
data.
did anything like that.
Because we analyzed their data and that's where we came to the conclusion that there were very strong correlations.
It happens to be in Nordella's white paper, and it's called right out, and he's got the data set right from AQMD's. You can just eyeball it, you see there's not a correlation, we didn't do an R squared, but it's obvious. So yeah, happy to share it with you.
Yeah, sounds good. So let me just conclude the meeting by thanking everybody for coming out on this very inclement rainy night and giving your time and your thoughts. We really appreciate your feedback and we'll try to incorporate that into the study as we move forward.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.